Ambition is one of the forces the ancient thinkers took most seriously, and also one of the forces they treated with most caution. They understood that ambition, without the right philosophical framework beneath it, tends to consume the very person it is supposed to serve. Aristotle, Cicero, and the Stoics, none of them condemned the desire to excel. What they did was insist on asking what the ambition is actually in service of, and whether the person holding it has the character to govern it properly. Aristotle wrote about Philotimia, so the love of honor, and he treated it with considerable caution. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he placed it between two vices. On the one hand, we have the excess, which is vain ambition. It is the excessive craving for recognition that is detached from any real substance beneath it. It is the person who pursues honor without the character or the achievement that would make that honor meaningful. On the other hand, there is the complete opposite of this. It is the complete absence of concern for honor. And Aristotle was as critical of this as of the excess, because the person who has no love of honor at all lacks the motivational force that a serious life requires. A person like this won't pursue noble aims, he won't accept the demands that excellence places on him, and he also won't push beyond the ordinary. But virtue for Aristotle was never simply the presence of equality. He was more concerned about the right proportion and the right aim. So Philotimia, when it is properly calibrated, was a necessary force. It was a force that could build something excellent or destroy something excellent, depending on whether it was governed by a decent character, sound character, and whether it is guided by clear reason or not. Now, Cicero made a similar distinction in his own political writings. He praised gloria, so the genuine renown that comes as a natural consequence of serving something larger than yourself with real excellence. And for Cicero, gloria was not merely personal reputation. It was the natural outcome of virtus expressed in service to the republic or to the civic community. The man of genuine gloria was not simply excellent in private. His excellence actually manifested outward into the world and left something behind it. But Cicero, of course, was equally sharp in his condemnation of ambitio, which in his usage meant the insecure pursuit of recognition through manipulation or spectacles. And the difference Cicero had in mind was not found in the desire for recognition itself, but in whether this desire was rooted in actual virtue or mainly just performing it. The man who pursued glory as the reflection of inner excellence was to be respected and praised, but the man who pursued it as a goal, pursued it as detached from any real ethical foundation, this man was to be condemned. So ambition in Cicero's framework had to be embedded in a genuine duty and restrained by moral self-awareness, or it could just become something corrosive. Now, what both the Greek and Roman accounts pointed toward, and where they ultimately converged, is that ambition requires a genuine end to serve. Without one, there is nothing to govern it against. There is no way to distinguish productive striving from mere restlessness, and there is no way to know whether the honor that is being pursued here is the real thing or just a hollow imitation. And for Aristotle, telos is the term for that end. Telos is the aim that gives any activity its meaning and direction. In his framework, every action has to point towards some end, and the quality of a life is determined by whether that end is genuinely the person's own and genuinely worth pursuing. And when this is applied to ambition, the telos is simply the answer to the question of what all of this effort is actually for. Without a clear end, ambition has no orienting principle and tends to fill all of the available space randomly rather than build towards something that is really meaningful and coherent to you. And this is where even serious people, so people who are already disciplined and who are already striving at a high level, can still go wrong. The goals are present, yes. The effort is real, yes. But the underlying aim can sometimes still be borrowed rather than chosen. It could be shaped by institutions, by the surrounding culture, or by what seems respectable or prestigious within a particular context, rather than chosen through genuine self-reflection and self-examination. And the result of all of this is what you might call existential mimicry, or pursuing what others around you pursue, adopting values that were never really yours, and of course mistaking any kind of striving for meaning. Now, the test that Aristotle offers, whether the aim that is chosen is actually genuinely yours, is to ask yourself whether the work you are doing will still feel meaningful if it were done in complete silence, if no one ever knew about it, and if no recognition of your efforts will ever follow. Because if the ambition depends entirely on visibility or on approval or on the awareness of being seen to strive, then it isn't rooted in anything solid. In this case, it is just a performance and therefore fragile. But if the work you choose, even when it is done without an audience, still feels good or aligned with something that you actually believe in, then you have found the right ground for build on. In other words, that is the kind of ambition that can sustain a good life, because it is chosen rather than imposed and driven from within rather than from without. Now, once the aim is genuinely clear, our next task is then to impose constraint. And this is where the modern understanding of ambition most consistently fails. The culture we live in these days equates ambition with expansion, with wanting more, with doing more, and with accumulating more across as many domains as possible. But ambition without constraint is indistinguishable from restlessness. And what restlessness does is it scatters our attention, it weakens our resolve, and it dilutes our focus to the point where the person who is technically working very hard is actually advancing very little. And Seneca saw this very clearly. To be everywhere is to be nowhere, he wrote. And that observation captures the root of most of our modern exhaustion with a precision that has lost nothing in over 2,000 years. Busyness is not a sign of importance or progress. More often, it is just a symptom of a disordered will. The person who attempts too many things simultaneously doesn't really build mastery in any of them. Instead, he becomes a servant to opportunity, constantly changing direction in response to whatever seems urgent or advantageous in the moment. And as a result, he ends up just further from what he actually wants, even when he appears to be constantly working hard or trying to work harder. Now, the disciplined approach to ambition, therefore, requires a capacity for refusal that most people simply underestimate. Choosing fewer targets and directing full attention toward each target isn't small-mindedness or lack of ambition. It is actually the only way meaningful work can be done. Because every refusal preserves energy for what is actually important or what has actually been chosen. Self-discipline in this sense functions more as a filter. Without this filter, order will collapse into chaos, regardless of how strong the underlying intention was. But even with a clear aim, a telos, and some genuine constraint, ambition still requires something that the modern obsession with constant productivity almost systematically destroys, which is an honest relationship with time and its natural movement. The Stoic talked about the importance of living in accordance with nature, and part of what that meant in practice was recognizing that effort and recovery are not supposed to be opposites of each other. The person who applies the same intensity to every single moment, every single day, who treats rest as a concession rather than a practice that deserves time, this kind of person is not demonstrating strength. He is demonstrating a failure to understand how human capacity actually works. And this is where Karl von Clausewitz offers something that goes beyond military thinking or strategy entirely. In his account of strategic conduct, Clausewitz argued that the decisive quality of a good general was not force alone but judgment under pressure, knowing when to advance, when to hold your position, and when to recalibrate was not a mark of hesitation for Clausewitz. It was actually the mark of strategic maturity. It is the thing that separated an effective action from blind aggression. He wrote that in war, everything is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. And that difficulty isn't purely technical. The difficulty here comes from the pressure to act constantly, from the fear of appearing indecisive, and from the deep temptation to mistake visible movement or visible activity for actual effectiveness. What Clausewitz called Fingerspitzengefühl, so literally fingertip feeling, was the quality he admired most in great commanders. To have Fingerspitzengefühl was to not follow rules blindly or follow any certain doctrine mechanically. To have Fingerspitzengefühl was to cultivate intuitive sense for what the exact moment actually required. And this can only be developed through years of genuine experience and years of honest self-reflection. The commander who possessed it could read a situation with a precision that no system or no protocol could replicate, because the situation itself was always more complex than any system actually can anticipate. And crucially, this quality could not be taught directly. It could only be developed by the person who took his own judgment seriously enough to actually examine it honestly, to notice where it succeeded and where it failed, and to refine it over time through sustained self-reflection and attention. And this exact principle governs serious personal ambition. The person who can recognize when full force is appropriate and when reflection is actually what the moment calls for, this person is not weaker than the person who charges forward without any discrimination. In reality, he is significantly stronger because his energy is applied where it actually produces an outcome, rather than expended where it produces nothing except the appearance of effort. Fingerspitzengefühl applied to our lives is essentially the capacity to sense the difference between the two. And just like Clausewitz, it is built through experience. It is built through honest attention and the willingness to examine your own judgments with genuine rigor, rather than simply trying to act and then move on. And finally, we have to talk about rest. Rest, when it is understood properly, is actually a vital part of all of what we've just talked about. The best athletes, they don't rest when they are broken or injured. They rest deliberately. They rest as a condition of lasting performance so that the effort they put in training can actually convert into strength and not just accumulate as systematic fatigue. The same logic also applies to intellectual and creative work. If the work continues without genuine intervals of recovery, our attention will begin to fragment, our thought will begin to lose depth, and the quality of our output will decay even as the hours worked increase. Rest and recovery are the conditions that allow ambition to endure over time, rather than exhaust itself and burn us out. Now, Aristotle also had a specific term for this. He called it Anapausis, so recuperative rest. And he treated it not as the absence of effort, but as a genuine practice in its own right. In his mind, this is something that belonged inside the structure of a serious life, rather than something that is reluctantly being conceded to when exhaustion finally forces a stop. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he argued that the person who understood how to rest well was not demonstrating weakness, but demonstrating a correct understanding of how human capacity actually works. Anapausis was not idleness. It was the deliberate restoration of the conditions that made serious effort in life possible in the first place. And the person who refused it or overlooked it, who pushed through every natural interval of recovery in pursuit of some constant visible output, this person was not more ambitious in any meaningful sense. He was simply less intelligent about the management of the one resource that all of his ambition depended on. Now, rest, of course, doesn't mean the same thing for different kind of work or different people. A person who works primarily with language or words might find genuine recovery in movement or in something that's physical and concrete, whereas a person who works primarily with other people all day long might find rest in solitude or reading. The principle is that recovery should address what the daily effort has actually depleted, so that the capacity to work seriously next day is maintained over time rather than gradually eroded. Anapausis, in Aristotle's account, was always proportional to the effort that preceded it and calibrated to what the next period of effort would actually demand. It was, in other words, itself a form of practical wisdom and it required the same quality of honest attention that every other dimension of a well-governed life actually required. And finally, there is also one last dimension to all of this that brings everything we've just talked about together, and it is the capacity for honest self-perception, because not all fatigue carries the same meaning. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from focused, purposeful work aimed at something that you genuinely find interesting and meaningful. You know why you are tired, and the tiredness sits alongside a sense that something real has been done. But there is also another kind of exhaustion, which comes from chasing too many things simultaneously, from constant comparison, from working without clear intention, and from ambition that has become anxiety wearing the mask of productivity. That kind of fatigue, it doesn't refresh even after a big reset. It just lingers and corrodes. So learning to distinguish between these two kinds of fatigue is itself a form of intelligence, and it requires paying genuine attention to signals that are easy to dismiss when the pace of any work is fast. The quality of your thoughts at the end of a working day, the tone of your inner voice when you think about what you are working towards, and the physical sensation in your body when you consider the workday ahead. All of these are forms of feedback. They tell you whether your ambition is actually aligned with something real and meaningful, or whether it has become loose from its foundation and started running towards anxiety and random habits or random ambitions. And over time, that calibration becomes what the ancients were talking about when they described the disciplined life. The disciplined life is not a rigid life. It is not a life of joyless self-denial. The disciplined life is a life in which ambition is governed by the person who controls it, rather than having ambition govern him. That is the distinction that actually matters. What matters is not how much you want, but whether what you want is actually yours and whether you have the character to pursue it without being consumed by it at the same time.